Curiosity, how many of your vehicles said really bad things about you this morning? Did they whine a little bit? Yeah.
I have a starter. I can just press a button on my phone.
So, in other words, what you're...
And it came on. No, I was waiting for it to cough a little bit. No.
No, that's good. I wasn't sure. So, in other words, you just weren't close enough to know if it said bad things about you. Okay. All right. That's good.
My kids gave me that last.
Oh, boy.
Is that nice?
Very much so. They come in handy right about, this time of year. I wonder if people, like down south, use the same thing only to have their air conditioners turn on. I would imagine that they do. It's just such a foreign concept for me because, typically speaking, most vehicles that at least I own and drive, the air conditioners don't really work most of the time. So I just open the windows, which makes it really, really cool, too, during the summer if I'm working construction because there's always lots of sawdust somehow accumulated onto my person. So I have like a whole asteroid effect going on in my car. It makes it really, really cool.
What's an asteroid effect?
So it's a lot of fun. There are certain things that I do with the chainsaw that tend to cover me in sawdust. And, when you're going 55, 60 miles an hour down the road, it's amazing how much of that just kind of kicks up and goes all over the place. So, yeah, but because mine doesn't really function. But I've never really thought of it very deeply. It's like having the air conditioner being super, super critical. For me, it always does the heat work, like really, really well. Is it some sort of strange furnace? Because, see, me and heat, we get along really, really well. As much as I don't mind cold, I do actually like heat, contrary to how sometimes my family thinks about things. I do have to watch it, though, because if I do put on anything that tends to keep me warm like this, I'm usually just fine, and everybody else is still frozen. And I can roll the sleeves. I'm like, all right, that's enough right here. Whew, we can turn that heat right off. Everybody else still feels like little popsicles. But, that gets me thinking about other great combinations. Now, some of these you may be thinking of, some of them maybe not. For instance, do I have any comedy fans in the audience? Like, comedy fans? Like, people that like to laugh and stuff like that? All right. I mean, how much better a duo do you get than Abbott and Costello? Can you think of any others? Great duos? Okay, there you go. See, they go together. Right? Just, can you imagine one without the other?
Mark and Tara. There's always one.
You should be able to predict who it is by now. Or like if you're sports fans, like Montana and Rice.
Bradshaw and Swan.
There you go.
You got Brady and the Gronk now.
Oh.
All right.
No.
Can you think of any others? I mean, great combinations. Where if you take one out, they almost lose meaning otherwise.
Peanut butter and jelly.
Ooh.
Root beer and ice cream.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Martin and Jerry Lewis.
Yeah. That's good.
Okay.
I only know that because, my grandparents and my dad.
Yeah. That's right.
I heard about that.
Yeah.
George Burns and Gracie Allen. I'm going way back. George Burns and Gracie Allen. How have I gone out?
Okay. So, in all kinds of areas, right? It's like you see one name, like if you're looking at the movie list, right? You see one name, it's like, all right, it's pretty decent. But then you see the second name and you go, okay, this went from maybe to absolutely have to watch it now because the two of these knuckleheads are together. Or if you're watching a game, you see that both of the players are healthy playing the game. It's like, all right, it's going to be halfway decent, even if everything else fails. You know that at least they're going to put on a good show for you. And it's always best when it's a combination, right? Because they can play off each other, whether it's sports or whether it's comedy or anything else. You always need to have that. In comedy, you always need the goofball, and then you need what they call the straight man, right? The guy that can keep the straight, even face or even look upset when everybody else is falling off of their chairs hysterically. And there are people that are really good, no matter how funny it is, at keeping a straight face. They make it, don't they? So, we love the idea that, the two together are so much better than if you took them individually and separated them and they weren't working together. Sometimes people in the business world might refer to this as like the synergistic effect. People begin to make statements that mathematically don't make any sense. In math, right, the whole equals the sum of its parts. But sometimes in things like this, we talk about how something is greater than the sum of its parts. Now, in math, that never happens. You can't get that. 4 plus 2 is never going to be more than 6. But when you put people together, because of how they can interact with one another, you get something that is better than if the two entities were working independently. So I'm going to go back into the book of Philippians because that's one of the things that I see here a little bit. And I'm not trying to rate people and give Paul apostle statistics in the Philippian church, church statistics or something like that, and construct some sort of strange metric system. But in looking at these two entities, Paul the person and the church at Philippi, I was struck with this. So I'm going to go, it's Philippians chapter 1. I'm going to start in verse 3. Even though I did touch on a little bit 2 weeks ago, I really only actually made it fully through the first 2 verses, and then I touched on a few other things, kind of giving some of the background of the church here. So if I hop in here in verse 3, it says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, and making request for you with all joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and in my defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers with me of grace. For God is my witness how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. Now, we began today by sharing some verses here. And if I wasn't going to hit on it today speaking, I would have shared verse 3. Because it strikes me just how interesting a statement that this is. I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. Now, there are a few things I can be confident of in this world. But if somebody looked at me and said, Mark, I thank God every time I think of you, I would wonder what was wrong with them. I mean, think about what that statement actually means. If you're thankful for them every single time God brings them to mind. Now, I think that actually says a lot about both parties here. Remember how I talked about two entities working together? I think this says a lot about where Paul's mind is. Because when you think about it, sometimes if we think of somebody and we're thinking something negative towards that person, can't that be as much a reflection on us? And where we let our minds dwell? But then think about then what that other person, or in this case what the church at Philippi was like, that Paul's takeaway was something where he was always thankful. Now, I don't want to put thoughts into Paul's mind, but if you think of some of the issues that crept in maybe with the church at Corinth, I would be hard-pressed to go, you know what, I think Paul was just absolutely joyful and thankful every time he thought about the church at Corinth. The church at Corinth gave Paul a hard time. It was not an easy assignment, that said. But I find it interesting that he says, I thank God every time God brings you to mind. And I think that indicates that there's something very, very special. He goes on in verse 4, always in every prayer of mine making a request for you all with joy. And I said 2 weeks ago that joy and rejoicing is one of the major themes, one of the major takeaways from the book of Philippians. Which is really, really odd when you think of his history, number one, in Philippi. Because Paul is there speaking, and through a series of events, basically being followed around by a demon-possessed girl, where finally he rebukes the spirit and it leaves her. This really, really ticks off all of the people who managed this girl and who made lots and lots of money off of her, basically, abilities because of being possessed. They were ticked off, so they got Paul beaten and then thrown in jail. Now, I don't know about you, but I would rate being beaten and then thrown in jail as decidedly negative life experiences. I mean, let's face it, when we reference about, waking up in the morning and maybe not looking forward to certain things. If I thought that there was a possibility that I would be beaten and thrown in jail in the morning, I would absolutely have some really, really negative thoughts waking up that morning. It's never anything like this. Maybe today I get smacked. That doesn't really ever cross my mind. I would really actually have severe concerns for anyone who looked forward to potentially being beaten that day. I would kind of wonder, maybe they have like a fever, maybe something even more pronounced. But let's face it, somebody that seeks out that kind of behavior tends to make a lot of us suspicious. Somebody that can't wait to get thrown in jail. And I don't necessarily think that Paul was looking forward to it. I don't think he was like, maybe today, we'll get to do this again. But he certainly didn't live in fear of it. I can't see any way, biblically speaking, that you could say Paul lived in fear of it. And I'm not just saying because it happened to him so often. He simply didn't stop in the face of it. So even if he didn't necessarily enjoy it, and I would assume as a rational human being, he didn't look forward to having this happen to him, but he did not live in fear of it. He wasn't cowed by it. So I find it really interesting. This is his history in the city of Philippi. Now, we know how it ends, right? Paul and Silas are doing what in jail? They're singing in jail. Not a hunger strike, right? And as a matter of fact, Paul waits until this wonderfully opportune moment to tell them, oh, and by the way, I'm a Roman citizen. Now, this gives the officials at Philippi one of those great big oh no moments. Because Paul is a Roman citizen, this is illegal. But furthermore, and I got into this a little bit a couple weeks ago, Philippi is what's called a colony. Now, for a city to be considered a colony city, it's like the highest status that the city of Philippi could achieve. They actually had direct access to the Roman courts. Hypothetically speaking, if you were considered a citizen in the colony city of Philippi, if you wanted to, you could have actually journeyed to the city of Rome to vote in the Roman elections. Sorry, they had no mail-in ballots. Do with that what you will. You had to show up in person. But if they wanted to, they could have. Now, this is a really elevated status. Furthermore, Rome used this as a retirement community, if you will, for soldiers, especially soldiers that served with Antony's army against Caesar Augustus. Augustus wasn't going to execute Roman soldiers, but what he did is he basically retired them early and settled them there, figuring that even if they were allied against me in a civil war, if I settle them in a Greek region, they're going to be more loyal Romans than they will anything else. And he proved out he was 100% correct. They loved their status as a colony. You just beat and imprisoned a Roman citizen. How do you think that's going to work out with your whole colony status? That's why they wanted him to leave and leave quickly. Now, he does leave, and he leaves relatively quickly, but if you look at the passage in Acts, he makes sure that he publicly gets escorted out. And people have conjectured various reasons about why exactly he did that. I personally don't think that he did that to stick it in their craw and make them sober. I think he did it basically to say, now remember, the people that I was associated with, don't try to play fast and loose with them either. You already have egg on your face over this. Furthermore, the fact that he's talking about joy is highlighted because not only was his experience in Philippi, that's to say, abbreviated, with less than desirable physical accommodations for a little while, he's writing this letter from prison. And Roman jails didn't give you cable TV. There was no opportunity for education. And that's just say that if you died in a Roman prison, they viewed that as all the better because then they didn't have to deal with you anymore. And I'm dead serious. Now, if he's doing well and he has good support, they would let him be under some sort of basically like a house arrest where he could have his own accommodations, but he would have to arrange that himself. The Roman government did not put people up in nice posh places while they were in jail. So even if he's under better circumstances, it's because he has supporters that are willing to, let's say, foot the bill. And people that are willing to come down. But either way, Paul is, let's say, not free to do whatever he feels like doing. Why? Why is Paul jailed? What did he do? What heinous crime had Paul committed? He preached the gospel. And when he was in Caesarea, in the land of Israel, he appealed to Caesar because he knew full well that if the Jewish authorities got their way and he was transported to stand trial in Jerusalem, they wanted to kill him. So he's basically imprisoned for what we would look at no legal reason. It's even admitted as he is giving his testimony to the Roman officials there that, man, if you wouldn't have appealed to Caesar, we could have released you. Notice they didn't say we would have released you. They said we could have. I mean, they're not always the same thing. And I think if we're honest, if we looked at it and we were placed in Paul's same exact situation, we would probably be pretty ornery. I mean, let's face it. How many of us enjoy being stuck behind a slow-moving car going through the notch? Or if there's too many people in line ahead of us at Target. Or Amazon said that I would have this on Tuesday. It's Thursday. What's going on? What happens if fast food is slow? I mean, let's face it. I fail at this area, regardless of even in little things if they're going well. And I think it's amazing that he's able to talk about joy. He prayed with them with joy. I'm looking at this connection between Paul and the Philippian church, and it's amazing because he's praying for them with joy. He's thankful to God on every remembrance of them. It says, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now. Now, people have heard of love at first sight, and this almost sounds like the ministry version of it. Being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. I love this idea that Paul's looking forward to seeing God's continual work in the Philippian church. And he's saying, guys, and it's not going to stop until God has brought you all the way through to the place that he wants you to be. Now, it's hard because we're familiar enough with this passage that maybe it doesn't hit as hard, because if I were to have read this for the first time, think about how encouraging that news would have been. I mean, Paul didn't get to stay very long. Now, he left people behind to at least try to help, but Paul basically had to get out of Dodge pretty fast, otherwise life for that church would have been more difficult. So imagine having a wonderful but abbreviated time with somebody like Paul, who would have shared with you the good news of what Jesus did. And almost just as quickly as he showed up, he's gone. And remember, he shows up out of the blue. They're not looking for Paul. They're not looking for the gospel to necessarily come in. If you remember in Acts 16, Paul's intending on going other places in Asia Minor until a man in a vision basically says, come to Macedonia. So he does. And we know from him going out to the river that the Jewish community, even in Philippi, is small, because otherwise they would have most likely had a meeting place more in the city. So it's conjectured that the city of Philippi would have had fewer than 10 Jewish males, head of households, to form a synagogue. It's almost like the gospel just walks in your door one day, and then all too quickly is forced to leave. But then you get this letter. How encouraging would that have been? That even though you remember him well, so does he. If I pick it up here in verse 7, just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers with me of grace. Paul's like connecting with them at a ministry partner level. For God is my witness how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And I think it's tremendous that we can sit here and look at this passage and understand that in a natural human-to-human time frame, Paul wasn't in Philippi long enough to develop those strong bonds that maybe a person can build with another person. In other words, you're looking at something that's not just a person-to-person connection, you're looking at a gospel connection. This is a love that it doesn't just originate in the human heart, it's a love that God gave them for one another to work together and to move together. There's something decidedly not just human about this connection. Now, real quick, can I have folks do something? I just went through verses 3 through 8. Now, depending what translation you have, maybe it'll vary. I used a New King James when I was doing this. Count the number of times you find the word you, your, or you all. Yes. That's how we know that Paul grew up in Tarsus, and he didn't grow up in like the Negev region because he'd have been in the south and he'd have said y'all. Tarsus. I'll get the right place. How many times do you see the word you, your, or you all? You have 7?
7, I have 7.
7?
8 if you count
Hmm?
8 if you count ye all.
Ye all?
Wait, which words are we looking for again?
You, your, or you all? Yeah, modern English doesn't give us a distinction between the singular use of you and the plural use, but older versions. 8?
I have 6.
You have 6.
Wait, which verse do we end at?
8.
Okay, we have 6. 8.
How many times do you see you all together?
2, 3.
So I have 4. If you go through, look at verse 4. So it says that always in every prayer of mine making a request for you all with joy. In other words, he's not just talking to just the leadership of the church. He's not just talking to maybe 1 or 2 special friends that he has at the church at Philippi. I take you all to mean, guess what? All of you. You all. If you go into verse 7, just as it is right for me to think this of you all. What is he thinking of? Thinking about having that work that God has begun in them completed until the day of Jesus. Because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers of me with grace. And then in the last verse, I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And again, after just looking at this again, once again, struck by this connection that Paul has again, not just with the leadership, not just with a special 1 or 2 people at this church, but there is this connection with the entire body of believers at Philippi. I mean, think about who is in that body of believers. There's the Philippian jailer and his family. I mean, isn't the account of the conversion of the Philippian jailer and his family one of the more dramatic accounts of conversion that you can think of? I mean, how many of you have ever thought about what it was like to have been like a fly on the wall, watching the Philippian jailer realize for the first time that Paul and Silas hadn't left. And that not only had he not left, he says, no, we're all here. And then that instead of Paul even railing against the jailer or anything else, what does he do? He shares the good news with him. Because he's in that church. He's in the church at Philippi. He and his family occupy, that little section over there, kind of that group, or this section over here. That if Paul were there in person with them, meeting with them, he would be fellowshipping directly with a group of people who said, wow, like that changed my life. In a very dramatic way. Who else would be in this church? No, that would be different. That would be the church of Colossae. Timothy would have journeyed with Paul. Lydia would be there. The one that he met out next to the river who, invited him back to her house. Did she know who Paul was? Probably not. I mean, could she inspect his, seminary degrees? I know what she did, though. She Googled him. Right? Who is this Paul guy? What did she do? She yanked out her iPhone 12 and... Oh! So, and some of you may get this reference here. So as I looked at this passage, there was a camaraderie that I saw between the church at Philippi and Paul that maybe it's my fault as a reader, but there's a camaraderie between Paul and the church at Philippi that I just don't sense from the other churches that he writes to. If I were to put it into modern parlance, I can almost picture Paul talking about the church at Philippi and saying, those are my boys. Now, I don't know how into literature and film that people get, but there's a phrase, actually, that was yanked out of Shakespeare and used as both a book title and then eventually as a miniseries title. It's The Band of Brothers. Wildly popular HBO miniseries. Ambrose pulled that and used it for the title of his book, talking about the Company E or Easy Company from the 506 PIR Parachute Infantry Regiment and the 101st Airborne. Easy Company basically got thrown into everything that really, really stunk in the European theater of World War II. They're like, hey, jump in an army, go for it, have fun. Hey, we want to jump for bridges to make Arnhem. Hey, you guys are going to jump. Congratulations. Will we get you? We hope so. Every single time there was like nasty battles, somehow they found their way there. As a matter of fact, they had realized that this unit was absolutely exhausted because they had been in near constant combat, even though as paratroopers you weren't supposed to be in near constant combat. So they pulled them back to a really, really quiet section of the front behind this wooded area in Europe called the Ardennes Forest. They said, nobody comes through here, we'll pull you back, and you guys can re-outfit and rest behind here. It's a thin area of the line, the Germans aren't going through, don't worry about it. And then there was this little ditty called the Battle of the Bulge, in which case, before they had even fully re-outfitted, they loaded them on trucks and drove them to Bastogne, and they said, okay, well, here's what's going to happen. See, the Germans are actually in the process right now of encircling the town. Actually, the road you came in on, congratulations, that's actually the only road that's left. And as soon as our trucks go through, that's going to close. You have a special mission. Don't give up the town, because if you do, you give up the vital crossroads, and most likely the Germans will be able to drive from here all the way to the English Channel. So, have fun and goodbye. Oh, and by the way, you need to get the ammunition from all the units you're relieving, because we don't have any extra for you. As a result, if you listen to their testimony come through, and again, Ambrose, when he researched these guys, used that Shakespearean phrase, band of brothers, because by the end of the Bastogne campaign, there was nothing they wouldn't have done for each other. Nothing. Now, granted, they had lost numbers from their earlier campaigns, but the group that was left would have done anything. They would have followed their commanding officer anywhere. And they'll bear it out. If you read their testimony, they would have gone anywhere. What a camaraderie. No matter what. And as I looked at this, I said, that's great, and I like history. It's what I studied. But when I looked at this, I said, folks, this is a gospel band of brothers. And I don't mean that in a gender sense. I mean that in a community sense. If you've never, ever watched the speech, the Shakespearean speech that it comes out of, I would highly recommend it. YouTube has a number of different versions of it. Some of them much more boisterous, some of them much more subdued. I actually prefer the subdued one. The context is Henry V, Shakespearean play Henry V, and it's before the Battle of Agincourt. And if you've never ever researched the Battle of Agincourt, the English army is vastly outnumbered by the French, yet they win. But the speech happens before the battle, and he basically says, look, we're going to fight. I don't know what the odds are. I can't guarantee your survival. And if you want to leave, I will pay your passage back to England so you don't die here. But if you die here, understand, or if you fight with me here, understand your name will never, ever be forgotten. And to some degree, obviously, most of us don't know all of their names, but they've been immortalized by Shakespeare. You know what? I'm willing to bet that most of us would find, if we could interact with these folks at the Church at Philippi, probably nothing terribly remarkable. I think that they would be common, everyday, ordinary people. They were like super Christians. They weren't more intelligent than anybody sitting in here. They weren't necessarily more talented. But because of the work of God in them, they were committed. And with Paul, they were his gospel ministry band of brothers. And I don't want you to take my word for it, because that would be really foolish. I want to show it to you, and I want to use two more passages out of Philippians to illustrate it to you. The first place I want to go is Philippians chapter 2. And I want to introduce you, starting in verse 25, to a guy named Epaphroditus, who, outside of the book of Philippians, I don't think he is mentioned once. Most of you, if you were going to name off like the major helpers and ministry partners of Paul, how many of you would roll Epaphroditus off first, second, third, fifth, eighth? Now, the big names like Barnabas, Silas, Timothy, Luke, they might make your A list. Epaphroditus, probably not. Listen to this. Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus. Look at this. Get this. My brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered to my need, since he was longing for you all, there's that you all again, and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick, almost unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him, therefore, in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem. Because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me. Now, what he means by what was lacking in your service was this. Not that they were doing something bad, but let's face it, the entire church at Philippi couldn't go journey to go see Paul. So they sent one of their number, Epaphroditus. And Epaphroditus apparently gets very, very sick to the point where it looked like death was more likely than him living. He says, since all of you couldn't come, you cared about me so much that you wanted to make sure at least something got through to me. And since you all couldn't come, you sent him. And I'm sending him back to you with the letter because I want you to know how thankful I am, and I want you to be able to rejoice in it. Again, we don't know who Epaphroditus is outside of the book of Philippians. But this is some pretty strong commendation for this guy. This is somebody who, kind of, if you're honest, doesn't he kind of sound like Paul? willing to risk life and death for it, not regarding his own life. How often do you think Paul sat there and said, ooh, I don't want to do that, I might die? If I'm honest, if my kids acted like Paul, I might have a conversation with them about reckless behavior. Conversation might go something like, you did what? Whoa, whoa, whoa. You went to some place and you tried to share Jesus with them, and they stoned you, and we're not sure if he was either stoned to death or almost to the point of death. Either way, if we were chucking rocks at my kids, I would not be like, I got a great idea, you should go back. And be honest. You folks with your loved ones, you would probably say something very, very similar. Epaphroditus, this is a person that Paul understands. Because he's someone that views sharing the gospel and gospel ministry the same way he does. If I go into chapter 4, you have to understand here, why did Epaphroditus go? Epaphroditus came to share some sort of physical ministry, physical support with Paul coming from the Philippian church. We're going to get a better idea of this here. Nevertheless, you have done well that you have shared in my distress. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, when he left them, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. Now we know Paul was a tent maker. He supported himself out in ministry, but the Philippian church felt strongly enough that they actually sent him support. The Philippian church, remember how I said that it wasn't even large enough? We estimate that it didn't even have a synagogue. This is not the largest church, and it's not the wealthiest church. This isn't the wealthiest city that Paul spent time in. But they're the ones that sent support. They're the ones that pitched in. For even in Thessalonica, which isn't all that far away, you sent aid once and again for my necessities. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. I got to supply my needs, but you guys cared enough to push in. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. Now, that phraseology is interesting because that's very, very similar to the phraseology used in Leviticus to describe the sacrifices that God commanded the Israelites to offer. A sweet-smelling aroma. If you go into Leviticus and you research like the burnt offering and stuff like that, almost identical phraseology. And my God shall supply all your need according to his riches in the glory of Christ Jesus. Now to our God and Father be glory forever and ever. Amen. Why was Epaphroditus sick unto death? Because the Philippians wanted to send aid for Paul's necessities again. Only this time Paul isn't in Thessalonica, he's in Rome, which is a journey all the way across. If you leave Philippi, you have to go all the way across the Balkan Peninsula on the Egnatian Way. You have to hop a boat and get into Italy, and then you have to travel up the Appian Way to make it to Rome. Without cars. You couldn't send him an email. Think about it. Just providing for himself to make the journey is a big enough deal, let alone actually sending any aid. And here's what I was left with, looking at this, looking at the connection between Paul and Epaphroditus, Paul and the church at Philippi, how Paul talked to this church. And it's unique. Go look at it for yourselves. Don't take my word for it. Read, here's a small time, read 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Galatians and Ephesians. Read Colossians. Not only does the Philippian church receive really no rebuke, the only word of rebuke that I see in the entire book is in chapter 4, beginning. It's addressed to 2 specific people. Other than that, nothing. The you all is always in a positive sense. And I was struck with this. Who am I corporately or individually connected to, like Paul is talking to the church at Philippi? Because that's what gospel connection is made to look like. Paul would have gone through, if you look at this, Paul would have gone through anything for these folks. And you know what? They would have gone through anything for him. They were on his mind, and every time God brought him to mind, he rejoiced. And they cared so much that they sent provision for him time and again, even to the point of risking one of their own number, Epaphroditus, and he took that risk willingly and came back to the church at Philippi happily. Think about that tone and think about that legacy and understand and read and reread the epistle to the Philippians, because it's awesome. Think about that connection. Think about the work that God did in Paul's heart and in the hearts of the Philippian believers. And I'm not trying to say that, Paul doesn't matter. I'm not trying to say that the Philippian believers don't matter, because what they have in common is God. They have Jesus in common. And you know what? So do we. If God can do it then and there with those people, why can't he do it again? You can see the impact of the ministry. The question is, are we willing to be used the same way as Paul and Epaphroditus and as the Philippian church? Are we willing to jump all in like that? It's not like they could get together on Skype and they could know each other that well through year upon year upon year. How many years have we, in many cases, known one another? Are we willing to go through that? And not willing to go through that and go, oh man, this is so hard. If you listen to Paul, he's almost happy about it. In fact, as we go through this book, you're going to realize, guys, you're in jail. It's actually a really good thing. How many of you would go, yeah, no, there's something wrong here? They understand what he's talking about. They're going, yeah, imprisonment can actually work out really, really well for you. There's a Philippian jailer over here that's going, yeah, if Paul wasn't thrown in jail, I would have never come to know Jesus. There's a mentality for you. I am not advertising that ever all of you try to get thrown in jail to do prison ministry. That is not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that, are we willing to look at things that normally we would look at as bad things and say, maybe God has an opportunity here to forge something beautiful? And could it further his plan more than it will further my agenda? Who are we connected to like this? You realize that Paul spent 3 years ministering in Ephesus? 3 years. No, 3 years is a long time for Paul to be anywhere as far as I can tell. Who else has that much time for that many missionary journeys? 3 years. I don't remember Paul ever addressing the Ephesian church the way he does the Philippian church. But he was in Ephesus a lot longer than he was in Philippi. And I'm not trying to say he didn't like the Ephesian church. But there's something unique here. And I hope that we can not get it here. I hope we can get it here. I hope God can change who we are through it. Because I can't do a whole lot to change the course of human history or much anything else. But he can. Who knows who he's going to use? Maybe it's you. Why not? It's all him anyways. You don't have to be the President of the United States. You don't have to be an ambassador to something to make that kind of difference. If you remember what Paul says, as a matter of fact, Paul achieves, quote unquote, his status by stepping away from human praise in human office. He walked away from, we could say, a cushy job within Judaism to do this. Why not? It's his show anyways. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for just the letter that we have here to the Philippian church. Thank you for your goodness. That you had him use these words and write them down. And just the example that we see. And Lord, work in our own hearts. Give us the love for one another that we see here displayed. Give us the joy and just the perspective that we understand that you're always working, you're going to keep on working, And things that we might take for granted as ordinary things, you can do extraordinary things with. And just ask that we would have these things sit in our hearts. Help us to pay attention to your news and not all the things that are happening around us. Not that we're ignorant, but that we would understand that ultimately you are in control. Help us to stay in tune with your program. In Jesus' name, amen.